Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Michelle Niehaus, and I am the Program Administrator for Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services with the Kentucky Division for Behavioral Health. This is our third webinar looking at the needs of individuals who are deaf and use American Sign Language and are seeking or needing substance use treatments. Today we'll be focusing on adapting treatment when you're working with interpreters. We reference some things that we've talked about in earlier webinars, so this is a friendly reminder that you can go back and look at old webinars that are archived and have access to both the PowerPoint and to the live webinar. In this session, we're going to be looking at language access when working effectively with an interpreter. We'll be providing nuts and bolts information on getting qualified interpreters in Kentucky. We'll talk about everyone's question, how do you pay for interpreters? And then we will also talk about more specific examples of adapting treatment to meet individualized needs. And one take-home is that putting an interpreter in the room is part of the access that's needed. But we want to make sure that everyone involved in substance use with the deaf community, substance use treatment, knows that you must all be responsible for communication happening effectively. And I'm happy to see from the polling questions that some of your programs do have line items in the budget to help plan the funding to pay for interpreters. And you are also thinking about which interpreters or interpreter coordinating agencies that you use in your area, because it's very important to establish those relationships and to plan ahead so that you're not waiting until the last minute to get language access in place. As we move along today, all of your lines are muted, but we welcome questions and comments in the chat box. As you can see, our screen is pretty busy with polling questions and the PowerPoint. We want to make sure that you can see Susan, our interpreter, and we welcome her for her first webinar with us. And you also can see Jesse and Deb. And everyone is kind of curious, well, why didn't you just start with how do I get an interpreter? How do I pay for an interpreter? And again, it's vital to know that it is everyone's responsibility to ensure effective communication. Everyone in the room, including the provider, the deaf individual participating in treatment, and the interpreter. The interpreters do provide basic access, but there is much more to do. And we do welcome you to go back to webinar number 2 and look at your Foundation for Ethical and Responsible Work. And so we put the link in this slide as well, and you'll have access to downloading the slides as we move through the webinar. So without further ado, I want to thank our funders for this webinar series. Sharon Hesseltine is our TA provider, and she's going to explain a little bit about what she does and how you all also have access to her support. Sharon?
Thanks, Michelle. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us on this third webinar of this Learning Collaborative. I work with what's called the Opioid Response Network. We're funded through the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and I'm actually part of a national technical assistance network that is really easily accessible to anyone across the country. So what we do with the ORN is folks are able to easily submit TA requests. We provide local or, when needed, national experienced consultants either in prevention, treatment, or recovery. And my role here in Kentucky as well as in Tennessee is as a technology transfer specialist. So what happens when folks make a request, those requests come to me and I follow up with an email and set up a call to just connect with folks about what their goals are. And technical assistance can be stuff that is bigger, such as a webinar series such as this, but it also can be very small. We have requests from providers that are, for example, looking to integrate medication to treat addiction into their services, or integrate peer support into their services, or even just say, you know, our staff really need more training in cognitive behavioral therapy or in motivational interviewing. If we can connect it to to opiates, then we are generally able to provide TA. For folks who are interested in submitting a request, the web address is right there on the screen. It's basically Opioid Response Network, and submitting a request takes maybe 5 minutes, and then everything from that point is really personalized. So the request process is really easy, and if you have an interest, please feel free to reach out to us. If there's something you're thinking about and you're not sure of and you'd like me to reach out to you, if you type it in the chat box, if you give me your, we have your email, I'll be happy to reach out to you individually to learn more about what your needs are. So without any further ado, I get the honor today of introducing our two presenters for this webinar and Learning Collaborative. And we're really, I think, fortunate in this series that we've got two national experts around serving individuals who are deaf and hard of hearing with a substance use disorder. Jesse Wilson is a state-certified substance use disorder counselor from San Diego, California. And Jesse is also the program manager at Signs of Life. And Signs of Life is the only standalone substance use disorder outpatient treatment facility for deaf and hard of hearing population in the United States. And then we also have Deb Guzman, and Deb is another leading national expert on providing treatment and recovery support services for deaf and hard of hearing individuals with a substance use disorder. Deb serves as a consultant and peer reviewer for SAMHSA, as well as for numerous SAMHSA grantees across the country. She's been the program director and grant manager at the Minnesota Chemical Dependency Program for deaf and hard of hearing individuals. She's been a consultant with the STEM project at the California School for the Deaf in Riverside, California, and has also been pupil personnel services director with the California School for the Deaf. Deb's published over 100 articles, several books, chapters, and presented at many national and international conferences. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to our presenters and let us really get in to the content today, which is really why you all are here with us. So thank you.
Hello. One thing that is very important is communication access and accessing and accommodating the patient's needs for treatment. Deaf patients have a variety of backgrounds, languages, and life experiences. And what's the most important is to get all that information from the participant or patient in order to determine their treatment needs. Typically, when I meet a patient who is deaf for the first time, it is good to ask them questions about their language needs. And those are pretty basic questions that you can observe and learn more about their educational level or their background or even their cultural needs. And while you're doing that, you can start making accommodations that the interpreter can start matching their language needs as well. The interpreter should be skilled in making those accommodations for the patient's language needs during the session as you go on. Now, we have a formal American Sign Language assessment available, and some states do have a variety of communication assessments that can be done, but typically you want to look at what the patient is doing with their facial expressions and matching their responses to that as well. Sometimes the patient will have language disfluency, and their understanding of English may be delayed, and it may not be sufficient. So you'll have to perhaps get a certified interpreter is what you might need to match their needs. When you meet a patient for a screening to do a communicate or any type of assessment, you'll want to ask them what their language preference is. Now remember, American Sign Language is a very visual, expressive language, and that will help you as well by using the interpreter skill to match the patient's needs during the screening. Deaf individuals have a variety of language needs. Some of them may be what's called oral and speak for themselves. Some people may use signed English, and some will prefer ASL. And some may use what are considered more gestures than language. And depends on where they grew up, what their home life was like. Where they were, there may not have been any access to formal language, so that would have delayed their language skills. Once you know the individual's preferences, it could change. Perhaps when the deaf person comes into therapy, they may be struggling with communication because they haven't had a way to have that access for many years. So it's a process that you'll go through as you go through treatment and adapting the communication needs based on the various styles, and their communication should improve while treatment continues. But what's important is to be aware of the differences in those styles and the individual needs. So the definition of a qualified interpreter under the Americans with Disabilities Act. A qualified interpreter is an individual who is expert in translating and accommodating the languages, but understand that even with facial expression and understanding culture, those are a part of the language that a deaf patient may need access to. So it's important to provide a qualified interpreter during the treatment experience. And also as well as with other services. There are certified credentialing organizations that credential interpreters throughout the state, and it's important to use those qualified credentialed organizations as well.
For many of you, finding a qualified interpreter might be the biggest challenge. I see that we have people on the call from Prestonsburg, from northern Kentucky, and from across the state. Usually in larger metropolitan areas, it's easier to find a qualified interpreter. In smaller rural areas, it's going to be harder, as you would expect. We also know that not all interpreters are qualified to work in substance use settings. There are a few ways that we try to improve the skill level of the interpreters we work with. One is that we will, as Kentuckians, we do send people to the mental health interpreter training in Alabama, where they do get some background around mental health specifically and a little bit on substance use interpreting. Dr. Guthman also offers online classes to go regarding substance abuse in the deaf community, and the Cady Center, through that program, the Cady Center also offers options. So as a hearing person who doesn't sign, it's really hard to tell if the person's hands are just moving really beautifully or if they're actually providing effective communication. So it's really important for you to vet your interpreters for their experience beforehand. Make sure that in Kentucky you have certified interpreters and licensed interpreters in substance use settings. You want to be consistent with interpreters throughout the process whenever possible. Sometimes if you have someone in treatment all day who's going to be going to multiple sessions, you're going to need to switch out interpreters, or you're going to need to have multiple interpreters working as a team. Generally, you'll see interpreters in a team switching about every 20 minutes, and that's so that their consistency and their accuracy can continue. It's an exhausting process to take one language and put it into another, and to meet the needs of individuals who have, like Jesse said, a wide range of communication needs. We know that rural signs and those of older adults can be different, and some people do have language disfluency. Then you may need to bring in like Jesse mentioned, a certified deaf interpreter, or CDI, or DI, a deaf individual who can take the concepts that you're explaining and break them down into more visual concepts. Not all hearing interpreters are able to do that at the level that a deaf individual may be able to. And likewise, many programs, especially when you're strapped for cash, might say, oh, well, let's use a family member or a friend. Unfortunately, most family members of people who are deaf and use ASO are not fluent in sign language themselves. So using family members is never going to be an adequate substitute. Resources for finding an interpreter. The Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing here in Kentucky offers listings both for individual interpreters or for interpreter coordinating agencies. So I refer you to those places to get more information. When you try to get an interpreter, it's really important to share information with them. Interpreters are covered under HIPAA as business associates, so you can provide the name of the individual and the type of assignment. This is critical because different interpreters are going to be a different match for different individuals, and you want to get the best match possible. You also want to consider allowing extra time. A typical intake is probably going to take longer if you're doing it through an interpreter, and it's also going to be better. I'm asking, can you all mute, please, if you're not already on mute, because I'm hearing a lot of background noise. Okay. If you can allow extra time when the interpreter is present, that will help with an intake. It might also help when you're doing individual sessions or group. If you have managed care, and that's what you're using to pay for the services, you can actually add extended session codes or interactive complexity codes to help account for your provider time doing that. In addition to allowing extra time within the session, you may also allow your providers to have time for what's considered a pre-session. They can do an overview of what's going to be covered, share information on any curriculum that you're doing, plan on what to do if communication breaks down, and review any specialized vocabulary or acronyms that you might use. Not all interpreters work regularly in a substance use setting, and so it's really important to make sure that they have the information needed to do well with the assignment. Paying for language access. This is always the biggest challenge because everyone wants the bargain interpreting option. And honestly, you get what you pay for usually. So things to consider. You do need to secure your funding prior to booking the interpreter. You really need to have your contracts in place with either individual interpreters or coordinating agencies before you need them. Having an interpreter contract with one interpreter is not going to fill the need. You need to have options available in case that person's sick or not available. Current rates for Kentucky interpreters are $40 to $55 an hour, and then usually it's an increased rate for nights and weekends. Most also charge a portal, which is their travel time, and or mileage fee. And usually there's a 2-hour minimum. Most interpreters also have a 24 to 48-hour cancellation, and that becomes the rub for many people, but that's part of doing business. Technology is available, and Deb's going to go into that in a few minutes, but most people will prefer an in-person interpreter in sensitive situations like substance use disorder treatment. So how do you pay for this? The Kentucky Medicaid Managed Care Organizations, the MCOs, currently all of them except for Passport will pay for interpreting services. We also have for community mental health centers an interpreter reimbursement process, and I can send you that information individually if you would like. Only the CMHCs are eligible for that, or DUI assessment and treatment providers in Kentucky. If you are a nonprofit or if you are a private agency, you can apply for up to $10,000 for ADA accommodations that you're doing, and that's through the DOJ tax incentives for businesses. So please do plan a line item in your budget Whether or not that cost is reimbursed, you are legally obligated to provide the access. And if you have more questions about that, please feel free to contact me after the webinar. So now the more interesting stuff, on to Deb.
I was actually going to say that great information that you shared, Michelle. So very helpful and great that it's on the PowerPoint tab available. Good morning, everyone. One of the questions I had for people, and maybe in the comment section while I'm talking you can indicate, is how many of you have ever used Video Relay Service, which is usually abbreviated as VRS. Maybe you can make a comment if you have. I'm going to talk just very briefly about the difference between Video Relay Service, called VRS, and Video Remote Interpreting, called VRI. So there are some definite differences that I'll talk about. So Video Relay Service is actually, as I've mentioned up here, the big thing about it is it requires high-speed internet. So if you don't have high-speed internet and a computer that has a camera on it, you won't be able to have access to video relay services if you're a deaf person because you're dependent on the video option. As a hearing person, just to give you a little idea of how it works before I go into more specifics, if you are making a phone call, even if it's to buy something on Craigslist, for instance, and you may have someone answer that gives you an interpreter number and says that they're going to communicate for you with a person using sign language to communicate. Typically, that would be an example of video relay service. So you would talk as you would to anyone on the phone, and an interpreter, such as you see Susan doing, will be seeing the deaf person, kind of similar to what you are seeing here. So let's assume that Jesse and Susan are speaking through video phone, and I'm the hearing person. So I would be calling Jesse. Susan would be interpreting for our phone call. Jesse and Susan would be seeing each other, and I would only be hearing the interpreter's voice on the phone. And so that's what a video relay service does for us. And basically, it's paid for through tax dollars. So there is no cost to you as the hearing person or to the deaf person. There are many, many different video relay service companies around the country. A few that are larger. Sorensen is a large one. Purple is a large one. There's different companies that provide the service depending on contracts. So certain state agencies may have requirements to use certain companies. So it varies. But the important thing for you to know is that you have access through video relay service to call and talk to any deaf person, and a sign language interpreter will be available for you. Some of the things that you need to keep in mind, however, is that the interpreter and the deaf person are the only ones that see each other. As I mentioned, you don't see them, and you are not allowed to be in the same room. So it's really meant to provide equal access to phone calls. It's not meant to take the place of having an interpreter if you have a meeting scheduled. It's really intended for phone access, equal access, so different locations are required. And I see that some people are putting comments. I haven't been really looking down. I don't know. Michelle, is there anything? Have people had experiences with video relay before?
It looks like we have 2 people who've used video relay services and not a lot of experience with VRI.
Okay, great. So we'll move on then to video remote interpreting. One thing I did want to mention, and maybe it's a resource that we could make available to you. Usually there would be an 800 number, and again it varies from company to company, so that if you did want to call a deaf person, you could use video relay. Nowadays, pretty much if a person gives you their phone number, you don't have to worry about calling a relay service to be able to access the deaf person. It's a direct connect situation. In the old days, you had to actually call the phone number for the video relay company and have them dial the deaf person for you. But it's becoming, with technology, so much easier to have the same kind of access as to hearing people would with a phone call. So you basically would call Jesse's phone number, and if you don't have a video phone yourself, it would connect with an interpreter service, a video relay service. So video remote interpreting. Now, it also requires high-speed internet, and it would require a computer with a webcam. And it's more likely to be used in critical situations, such as medical care, a very brief court kind of situation because it's not ideal in that situation, and first responders. So basically it enables two people who speak different languages to be in the same location and use American Sign Language for communication. So for instance, a doctor and a patient can communicate with the deaf person through the sign language interpreter. Everybody sees each other at the same time. Now, let me sort of give you some of the pros and cons, however. And on our PowerPoint, we actually have a video that shows you the negative parts of the video remote interpreting. Because imagine, such as we are right now, let's imagine that we're doing this call, and all of a sudden, the internet goes off and it freezes. Jesse would lose communication with Susan. Imagine if you were in a hospital and you're finding some very, upsetting information you're receiving from a doctor, and they have this computer that they move in front of you for you to watch an interpreter on, live interpreter, because they couldn't get one to come to the hospital in person. Maybe it was in the emergency room, and all of a sudden the system freezes. Here you are, you're very stressed, you're not feeling well, something's critically wrong with you, and you're not getting any communication. So that's one of the big negatives is technology, and we can't always control that. So some of the positives are, if I went into an emergency room and interpreter couldn't be obtained quickly, hospitals may have on wheels is one setup, a computer, and they would, using the internet, using a system maybe similar to what we have now, an interpreter would come on screen, and as I speak, the interpreter would sign what I'm saying, the deaf person would sign questions, and the interpreter would voice those questions to the doctor. So if technology is working and the system is set up and the interpreter is skilled, communication can happen. Now, it's not necessarily advisable. For instance, if I was a doctor doing a physical on somebody and I have this computer, it's not the best or personal way to really be trying to do a physical examination or any kind of long-term, appointment, because how do you have this object move around with you in the same way as a person can? So, for instance, if you have a sign language interpreter in person, they try and move with the physician so that as a deaf person, you're looking at the doctor and you're looking at the interpreter, and you have some control of your environment because the interpreter is trying to follow along with the doctor. Well, if you're dependent on this inanimate object of a computer screen, you don't have that same control. Often, people use an iPad. So you have a very small object that the deaf person is looking at, and again, they're not able to really have that same kind of sense of connection, in this case, with the medical professional. I know some cases where people in a meeting might use a video remote interpreter. And again, imagine as a deaf person for an hour looking down at this iPad while all of your peers are interacting with each other. So with interpreting, if you've been at our sessions, you've learned sometimes there's a little bit of lag time, so that I'm looking down at this iPad, I'm missing what's going on around, and I've got this lag with me. So video remote interpreting is really not recommended for long group meetings that are happening or a conference seminar that's happening. It's really intended for emergency situations where there's no option for communication, or if you're in a rural area and maybe the session's going to be 10 minutes and you need communication, but it's not going to be very intense, very emotional. It's just very matter of fact, that kind of a situation. So brief appointments, last-minute requests, Let me go on to the next screen here. Emergency kinds of situations, those are the situations that it might work best for. As Jesse talked about, just because you're a deaf person who uses sign language doesn't mean that every single person's communication needs are the same or their preferences are the same. And so that's another reason why a video remote interpreting situation isn't always the most feasible situation to use. Again, if I'm using an iPad and there's 3 or 4 deaf people trying to look at this interpreter at the same time, everyone with different kinds of communication styles, people are losing information and losing access for communication. So most individuals, if asked, would say that they would prefer a live interpreter for day-to-day kinds of interactions, for meetings, for appointments, and that this should only be used in cases where it's an emergency situation and until you can get a live interpreter to be present. So there's definitely some positives, because in the days prior to video remote interpreting, a person would be in an emergency room with no communication, which really is unacceptable. So this gives some options. There is a cost to video remote interpreting. Most hospitals have contracts with companies that provide video remote interpreting options. And then they pay a set rate, and then they would pay a rate if it was utilized. So it's not a free service. It's intended for being in the same room, the deaf person and the hearing person that needs the service, where, as I mentioned, video relay interpreting, you must be in different locations. Jesse or Michelle, is there anything you want to add? I hope I didn't get people confused.
No, I think you did a very thorough discussion. I'd really like us to be able to spend most of our time on Jesse's slides around working in the individual environments. So if you could just give us a brief overview.
Keep going.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yep. Do you want me to go on to this, Michelle, or
sure? If you could just
you wanted to skip over this?
If you could just give us 1 to 2 minutes on the ASL Star, that'd be great.
Okay, let me go back then.
Yeah, just for the interest of time, we need to be pretty brief. Thank you.
Yep, sounds good. All right, the ASL Star, which I'll briefly talk about, was developed through a federal grant, and what we basically did is we validated 9 different screeners in American Sign Language, and this is available free of charge for all of you to use. So if you go to sardiprogram.com, you'll be able to see all of these assessments in American Sign Language. There are several that are related to drugs and alcohol. You'll see the audit up there, and you'll see the DAST. And then there's several mental health screeners, and there's one career interest screener. When you get onto the website, you'll see that the first green box on the left, you can go to and learn more about deaf culture. There's a training that is available to you. And then you will also have a training module for all of those 9 screeners. And then on the far right, if you had a client that you wanted to take one, this is all HIPAA compliant, an individual, you would register them and you would go to this box, and the individual would take that screener and you would be able to get results such as I've shown here. So this is a person who took the DAST, and on this they had 5 in the affirmative, which indicates on the DAST that a more in-depth assessment is recommended, and this scores it for you, tells you the recommendations, and you're able to print this off. So it's an excellent resource for you to use, and I'd encourage you to go onto the website and take a look at it to become more familiar with it. This is what you'll see when you first get onto the SARDI, and underneath on the left side it says provider, and that's where you would click, and you need to register to have access to this. And then your clients for taking the screeners would click the box on the right side. So Jesse, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Deb. That was great. A great explanation of VRS and VRI. So that was perfect. So now I would like to discuss setting up the interpreter when you have a provider, when you have the patient with you. When you meet your participant, it's important that you meet with the interpreter prior to that meeting so you can have everything arranged. And the interpreter may or may not understand substance use and treatment. You won't know that until you get to meet them for the first time during that pre-session. And you can talk with them to find out what their background is, what their knowledge level is, so they have so they know the approach of therapy that you'll be using. And it's important to clarify the vocabulary with the interpreter. For example, intake, what the intake process will look like. There'll be questions on the screener that you'll be using. That vocabulary might not be familiar to the interpreter, and you'll want that to explain that so they have the knowledge before the session starts. So it's important that you have that pre-session with the interpreter before the two of you meet with the patient. You'll maybe perhaps want to use pictures if possible, like a calendar, to help explain concepts behind your questions that you'll ask the patient. During your intake, it's important that there may be difficult questions, maybe sexually related. Have you had sex before? And it's important to remember those will be very sensitive questions, of course, to the patient. And you'll want to have that relationship with the interpreter so everyone is comfortable with those kinds of questions, and discuss that with the interpreter after the meeting. Many times the patient may not understand the question, and you'll have to, if someone's asked it in signed English, they'll have to translate this question from English to ASL to help the patient get a better conceptual idea of the question. And by knowing when those situations will help provide a better therapy session for the patient. When you're dealing with the treatment plan and working with the interpreter, there can be concerns. So it's important to develop a treatment plan with the patient and that relationship with the interpreter. So when you have that meeting with the interpreter, before any session, explain the concepts that you plan to present during that session. For example, if you're going to use a timeline, what's the purpose of that timeline? And what's the end result? For example, if you're working with a patient on the first part of their treatment, you'll have to explain about them going to groups 4 times a week for 2 hours for each group. And the patient will say, why do I have to go so many times to so many groups? So you'll want to take the time to explain that clearly and have that set up planned early for recovery. So you want to emphasize that and explain that concept to the patient. So when you're meeting with the interpreter prior to that, or to develop any kind of treatment plan, point those things out so they're prepared to explain those concepts clearly. The interpreter may need a little extra time to explain some of the concepts to the patient during your treatment planning because the patient may not understand a concept addressed in the treatment plan. So you'll want to give the interpreter a moment when needed to help catch up in your explanation and pace yourself to match the interpreter so they're done with the concept before you move on. Don't use third-person language when you're speaking to your patient. Don't say tell her, tell him. Talk directly to the deaf individual, and the interpreter will take care of that, just like you were in the room with them without the interpreter. Be aware that the interpreter is only responsible for translating the information. That's it. The interpreter will not have any other outside role during the session. You'll need to interact with the deaf individual like the only two of you were in the room and not ask for any input from the interpreter. Many times, a counselor or any other type of professional provider will expect the interpreter to supervise the patient while the provider leaves the room, but the interpreter does not have that requirement. That is not their responsibility. The rules typically is when the provider leaves the room, the interpreter will exit the room with you. So it's never the interpreter's responsibility to stay in the room and monitor a patient. During the treatment planning session, it can be very emotional, typically for the deaf person. And perhaps the interpreter will struggle a little bit with the patient. However, just maintain what you're doing and continue along with the patient. And then during the post-session, you can discuss that in the meeting with the interpreter afterwards if necessary to review the session with them. And then you can get a feel for if you're getting through to the patient or not. Oftentimes, perhaps you're getting through to the patient and you realize after the session you weren't as successful as you thought. So the meeting with the interpreter afterwards would be to help determine if something needs to be reviewed in a second appointment with the patient when you're better prepared to address those concerns. Treatment assignments. When you are talking with an individual, whether it's on one-on-one appointments or in group, you can use those in either situations. It is really helpful to use a collage cut out from magazines, newspapers, any other type of material that you may have available that the person can put together a pictorial example. Because remember, a deaf individual tends to be very, very visual. And it's very important that their emotions can be displayed visually, just like it's painting a picture in their head. So they can be expressing themselves more effectively, perhaps, by while as using an interpreter may be a little bit limiting for them. So a collage is a way to help match those feelings. It can be any type of artistic role, any type of artistic experience can help. Also, there are things called Sober City, where a patient can build a collage or a painting or a drawing, whatever you have available to them, identifying what their resources that they can use to help them maintain their sobriety, so they can have a visual experience of what they dream or what they imagine their sober environment to look like, and what their support system can be when they're in recovery. So you can do that in one of the group sessions. It's kind of a cool experience. Spirituality. It's never easy with a new patient if they have no prior experience with the concept of spirituality. So it's important to use perhaps role play, and the interpreter can explain the concept behind spirituality for a deaf patient. And role play is awesome. It really does help the counselor get involved with the deaf person, and it also helps develop a better relationship between the counselor and the deaf person. There are very many movies and videos in ASL and captioned videos as well that can be used to help you supplement information during the treatment experience. And then again, remember, the patient doesn't always have a great balance or a foundation in English for a captioned movie only, so you may still need to use the interpreter during the movie. So you want to check with the patient whether they understand the captions or not, or best to use the interpreter. And again, here are some more tips of working with an interpreter during role play situations. It's helpful to meet with the interpreter and prepare them beforehand if you're going to ask them to be involved in a role play. It's important to make sure the concepts are being presented and that they are capable of staying in that role, and to expand the information you're providing related to facial expression, body language, and that they're not using any judgment in their facial expressions when they're interpreting that information. If they don't have any experience with treatment, an interpreter may have to control having a neutral facial expression as well. It's important to emphasize to the interpreter about the emotional goal of the session and what part of the deaf person's situation will be discussed during the treatment to help motivate the patient to consider why this is important to their treatment. Oftentimes the patient will not think about the problem. They don't want to address that. And then they'll say it's other people's responsibility in the situation. They don't want to be accountable. So it's important to emphasize the point of the role playing and encourage the patient to consider their role in the situation being discussed, what their part of the accountability is in that situation. Again, it's important to meet with the interpreter before group such situations as well, and that they understand what the rules of the group are. For example, switching back and forth between people who's talking, making sure one person talks at a time and they clarify that. Letting the interpreter, if the interpreter didn't understand something or understand a concept, making sure they have a chance to clarify that before they interpret. The interpreter could interrupt during the group at any time as well if they're struggling with a concept, if what is being discussed is unclear. So you'll want to make sure the group knows what the interpreter's role is if they're going to discuss something or interrupt. It's really important about turn taking so people aren't talking over each other and there's no crosstalk. When you're in the group, most of the time, the hearing patients in the group may have never experienced having an interpreter in a session. So it's important to introduce the interpreter to the group and explain what the interpreter's role is. And that will help facilitate getting started more smoothly if they understand that. And whatever the rules are in the group of identifying who's talking, having someone raise their hand, or making sure that the deaf person knows who's speaking, if they want to lead a group, it's possible to do that, but the deaf person may not feel comfortable permitting themselves to make a comment at any time in the group. So you want to help offer tips to them and making sure you're paying attention and giving the deaf person the eye contact they need and watching their body language to see how they're interacting in the group. They may be trying to raise their hand but not know the right time of when to interrupt. Because talking in a group goes so fast, sometimes they're not able to break in there. So you want to keep an eye on the deaf person to see if they want to make a comment and give them that opportunity during group. I think I'm going to give it back to Deb now.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jessie. Great job talking about things to keep in mind with interpreters. I think really the turn taking is so important, and ways to set up the rules in the group to make sure that everyone has a fair opportunity to speak when there's an interpreter involved is great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some ways that you could make Step 2 visual. For those of you that were involved last training that we had, I talked a little bit about Step 1. Today I'll talk about Step 2, and at the last session, if there's time, we'll do a brief discussion about making Step 3 and the higher power concept visual. So Step 2, when we describe it to the clients, we talk about it being a hope and help step. So the assignment options that we use for this step really has to do with that. So how it feels to ask for help, because some of the clients really struggle with asking for help and not trying to just take care of everything themselves. So talking about times people have helped them, listing who those people are that you may trust and why you trust them, and places that you could go to get to support. So it's really giving you hope that there's people out there that you can get help from and how to go about doing that. So when we give a person a step 2 assignment, you can see there's a lot of empty spaces because it's really tailored to the individual need of that person. So I wanted to show you some client work samples. One of the assignments is to draw a picture of yourself a year from now if you're still using and what you would look like. So this is a picture of this particular client, and you can see pretty much skin and bones, not doing so well. And this is how they would portray themselves if they continue to use a year from now. Here's another very, very moving picture of a client who's up in the front in a coffin, dead. Obviously, if they continue to use, they see themselves dying, all of their family members that have come to their service. And then here's an example of a person who is able to have a friend and get some help from them, and you can see there's a sun in the sky. It's a very different kind of looking picture and very visual as well, that shows us that they're very happy, that they're able to see hope again and to get help. So this is just a sample of one of the ways that we make some very abstract concepts, such as the steps, much more concrete, just something fun to share with you. Jesse, do you want to wrap up for us?
Well, remember, like I said, when you're working with the interpreter, that to get the best outcome, you must make that a team. There is no one-size-fits-all when it comes to language access, so you'll want to work together on that. Make sure that the information you're providing to your patient is as visual as possible, using a timeline, using a calendar, making pictures, having them cut out pictures from magazines, finding things on computer. All those things will help make a more visual experience for your treatment experience. And it's very important to be flexible. Be willing to adapt your plans to meet the consumer's needs.
Deb and Jesse, you all did a great job of explaining both how to work with interpreters and how to continue to hold the responsibility that effective communication belongs to everyone. Interpreters are fantastic with their language and being able to translate between English and ASL. At the same time, a provider doesn't lose the responsibility to explain the recovery concepts and to figure out how best to match their individual client. I see that somebody had a question around discussing step 2 in AA or NA. And yes, the pictures that were shown were examples of how the Minnesota Chemical Dependency Program encouraged providers to work with individuals to make step 2 really visual. So there is material that you can get, and we have copies of the curriculum for steps 1 through 3 in Kentucky. We can actually mail to you if you would like to have copies of that curriculum. And we want to know what other questions you have as we move towards the end of this webinar today. Are there any other questions that you have? We're going to go ahead and ask you as well, what concerns do you have about working with interpreters? And then also, what information or resources would you like covered in our 4th and last session? I see that one person has already said that they want to make sure they understand the intricacies of and making sure that they show courtesy and respect to not offend the client. And those are really important concerns. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of intricacies in working with interpreters. It's not as simple as saying, hey, I want you to say everything I'm saying and exactly sign it. That's not how interpreting works. So everyone needs to be mindful of what information is being understood and what information is not, and to do repetition and to do checking in to make sure that you're not blowing through concepts thinking that, oh, I can just go as quickly with this as I could with anyone else, or playing down to the deaf individual and condescending when the person understands everything perfectly. So just like you individualize your care for a hearing person, you individualize your care for a deaf person. And someone also said making sure their concepts are conveyed correctly. And Jesse and Deb did a great job explaining some ways to do that in terms of making it visual, checking in with a deaf individual, asking them to summarize it in their own words. Those are all really important things to do. There are a few resources that we would like to be able to share with you. 2 books that I really enjoy. One is Deaf Mental Health Care, edited by Dr. Glickman. Deb wrote a chapter in that book about substance use treatment, so I would highly recommend that book to you. And then we also mentioned language disfluency a few times. A huge problem we see in Kentucky and across the country is language deprivation, when people did not have early exposure to American Sign Language and didn't have access to English because of their hearing loss, and that can result in language deprivation. So many of the people we see coming into the community mental health centers have long-term effects of that language deprivation. So I would recommend to you reading the book edited by Dr. Glickman and Wyatt Hall with chapters from a variety of people as well. It's a great resource for you. Deb mentioned some videos. We didn't play them here. They're a little bit salty, but you might want to watch these videos in your free time. One talks about the role of an interpreter, and then the other one shows how VRI can go wrong. So those are both good things to consider. And seeing no more questions, I would welcome you all to join our last webinar on January 13th and to email us if you have specific things you would like to look at. I see that someone wants more ideas about visual ways to explain recovery concepts. So I think we'll be heavy on that in our last session and giving you some really good pithy ideas on making concepts visual. And I would encourage you to also spend some time thinking about that yourselves. If you had to draw recovery, what would that look like? If you had to draw relapse, what would that look like? Or how could you do that in a role play? What are some other more interactive ways you could do that? So we thank you so much, Deb, Jesse, and Susan, for presenting today. And we look forward to having our wrap-up session on the 13th. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you all for the great work that you do every day, all of you. Have a happy holiday season.